Park Jo-gun stared at the gold locket on his desk. The metal was still warm, as if someone had just set it down. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, something the Ice King's hands never did. 3 years. He hadn't seen it in 3 years. The last time he touched it, his hands had been steadier, fastening the delicate chain around Angelina Rose's neck in that New York hotel room. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and something sweeter, still haunted him on sleepless nights. He'd promised her then, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know he had. "I'll never forget." Now the locket sat on his mahogany desk in Seoul. Impossible. Real. Mocking him. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're already feeling the tension and want to see where Jo-gun and Angelina's journey takes them, hit that subscribe button. You'll be joining a community that lives for these heart-wrenching, beautiful stories of second chances. Now, let's continue. They called him the Ice King for a reason. He didn't get to the top of Seoul's business world by being soft. Competitors crumbled before breakfast. Executives lost their jobs before lunch. His assistant once said watching him work was like watching a glacier move, slow, inevitable, crushing everything in its path. Tonight was no different. A stack of employee termination papers sat beneath where the locket now rested. 20 names, 20 families, just another round of cuts, just another Tuesday. But this locket changed everything. Jo-gun turned it over in his fingers. The gold caught the lamplight, sending fractured reflections across his desk. His assistant had sworn, voice shaking slightly because no one lied to Park Jo-gun, that no one had entered his office that morning. But someone had. Someone who knew exactly what that locket meant. Someone who understood it would unravel him. The engraving was still there, worn but readable. A.R. Forever yours. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Angelina was in America. She had to be. He'd made sure of that, made sure she couldn't find him when he'd left, made sure he'd never have to face what they'd had. So why did it feel like she was closer than he thought? He couldn't focus all day. During board meetings, his hand kept drifting to his pocket, fingers brushing the locket's edge. During conference calls, while executives droned about quarterly projections, his mind drifted back to New York, to her smile, the way one corner lifted higher than the other when she was trying not to laugh, to the way she'd thrown her head back, laughing at his terrible English jokes, her joy so pure it had physically hurt to witness. To the morning he'd left without saying goodbye because he was a coward who didn't know how to do real feelings. Now, at 11 p.m., he sat alone in his office. The Seoul skyline glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. The city that feared him, the building that bowed to him, and he couldn't even focus on simple termination papers. He pulled out the documents again. 20 names, 20 people losing their jobs tomorrow. He picked up his pen. Then he heard it, a soft sound, like something moving under his desk. He froze. The pen hovered above the signature line. His office was on the top floor. No one had access except his secretary, and she'd left hours ago. Security was airtight. He'd made sure of it after the last corporate espionage attempt. The sound came again, a baby's giggle, bright and pure in the sterile silence of his office. His heart stopped, actually stopped for a beat before slamming back against his ribs. Jo-gun pushed his chair back slowly, the wheels whispered against marble. He leaned down, looked under the desk. A baby, crawling toward him with chubby, determined hands and soft, curly hair that caught the light. She wore a white onesie, slightly rumpled, and around her tiny neck, a gold locket exactly like the one in his pocket. The air left his lungs. Before he could move, before his brain could process what he was seeing, a flash of blue shot across the floor. A woman in a cleaning uniform dropped to her knees, scrambling to grab the baby. Her hands shook. "Ruby, no! Come back here!" The woman's voice cracked with panic and exhaustion and something that sounded like fear. Jo-gun knew that voice, would know it anywhere, in a crowded room, in his dreams, in the 3 years of silence that had followed their week in New York. Angelina? Time fractured. Angelina froze. Her hands were still reaching for Ruby, fingers extended, but her body had gone completely still, like she'd been turned to stone. Slowly, so slowly it hurt to watch, she looked up from the floor. Their eyes met for the first time in 3 years. Jo-gun couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare. She looked different, thinner. Dark circles shadowed eyes that used to sparkle. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun that looked painful, and her blue cleaning uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost weight. The name tag said Angela, with a fake last name. But those eyes were the same ones that had looked at him across a New York hotel bar and changed his life for one perfect, terrifying week. "Mr. Park," she said quietly. Her voice was formal now, cold as winter glass, like they were strangers, like she hadn't once whispered his name in the dark, making it sound like a prayer. She scooped up Ruby, movements practiced and weary, and stood. "I apologize for the disturbance. It won't happen again." She turned to leave. "Stop." His voice came out harder than he meant, sharper. She stopped but didn't turn around, her shoulders tensed beneath the thin uniform fabric. Jo-gun stood up. His mind was racing, doing calculations, putting pieces together with the same precision he used to destroy competitors. The baby. The locket. 3 years. The math took 2 seconds. Turn around. Angelina hesitated. He watched her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. Then, slowly, she faced him. Ruby was resting on her hip, tiny fingers playing with the locket around her neck. The same locket, the same delicate chain. "How old is she?" Jo-gun asked. His voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut. Angelina's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." "How old is she?" 2 years and 4 months. Her voice barely above a whisper. The room went silent. Even the city noise from below seemed to fade. Jo-gun pulled the locket from his pocket and held it up. The twin to the one around Ruby's neck. "You left this on my desk this morning." Angelina looked at the locket, then at Ruby. "It fell off while I was cleaning. I came back to get it tonight. Ruby got away from me. I'm sorry." "You're lying." Her eyes flashed with something, anger maybe, or hurt so deep it had calcified into rage. "Excuse me?" Jo-gun walked around his desk slowly, each step deliberate. His eyes never left the baby. Ruby had his mother's nose, he'd seen it in enough photographs, his father's chin, that same slight cleft. And when she looked at him with those curious brown eyes, he saw himself staring back, saw his own childhood face in photographs. "She's mine." It wasn't a question. Angelina pulled Ruby closer, protective. The baby made a small sound of protest at being squeezed. "You don't know that." "I know." He stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into Angelina's face, close enough to smell baby powder and floor cleaner, and something underneath that was still her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Something in her broke. He watched it happen, watched 3 years of carrying everything alone finally crack through her careful composure. "Tell you what?" Her voice shook now, trembling with suppressed emotion. "That the Ass King got someone pregnant during a 1-week fling? That I tried calling you 50 times and your secretary kept blocking me? That I showed up at your company 6 months pregnant and security threw me out? She was shaking now. You made it very clear you didn't want to be found. Jo-gun felt like he'd been punched. Actually, punched. The air left his lungs, his chest tightened, his vision tunneled. I never knew you called. Of course you didn't. You were too busy building your empire. Angelina adjusted Ruby on her hip. The baby was getting heavy. He could see her arm trembling with the weight. We're fine without you. We don't need your money or your guilt. That's my daughter. She's my daughter. You're just the man who gave me one perfect week and then disappeared. Jo-gun looked at Ruby. Really looked at her. She was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. Not afraid, just curious. Then she did something that stopped his heart. She reached out a tiny hand toward him. Without thinking, he touched her fingers. They were warm, soft, real. They wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. Something inside his chest cracked open. Not broke, cracked, like ice in spring, like something frozen finally beginning to thaw. The sensation was physically painful. What's her name? He asked softly. His voice didn't sound like his own. Ruby. Angelina's voice was quieter now, watching him with wary eyes. Ruby Park-Rose. He looked up at her, still holding Ruby's tiny hand. You gave her my name. She deserves to know where she comes from, even if her father doesn't want her. Jo-gun's hand tightened around Ruby's tiny fingers, gentle, protective. I want her, and I want you, both of you. Tomorrow morning, you're moving into my penthouse. Angelina laughed, but it was bitter, sharp enough to draw blood. You can't just order people around like this is a boardroom. Watch me. He walked back to his desk, picked up his phone, called his assistant. At midnight. Prepare the guest suite. I'm bringing someone home. 2 people, actually. A woman and a baby. They'll need everything. Clothes, food, toys, everything. Have it ready by morning. He hung up and looked at Angelina. Her face was a mixture of shock and anger, and something that might have been hope if she'd let it be. Your world is too dangerous for her, she said quietly. My world? He looked at her blue cleaning uniform, at the exhaustion carved into her features. You're scrubbing floors at midnight to feed my daughter. Tell me again whose world is dangerous. Angelina had no answer for that. Jo-gun didn't sleep that night. After Angelina finally agreed to stay in his penthouse temporarily, her voice tight with reluctance and pride, he sent her home with his driver and a security team. Then he sat in his office until sunrise, making calls, planning. The Ice King doing what he did best, taking control. By 8 a.m., his entire executive team was in the boardroom. Confused, angry. Several still held coffee cups, clearly dragged from their morning routines. They demanded to know why they'd been summoned on 0 notice. Jo-gun walked in at exactly 8:15. Angelina was beside him. She was still in her blue cleaning uniform because she'd refused his offer to buy her new clothes. Pride, he'd learned, was something she wore like armor. Ruby was in her arms, looking around the massive boardroom with wide, curious eyes that took in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the chandelier that cost more than most people made in a year. The room went silent. Utterly, completely silent. Director Kwon, the vice president who'd been trying to take Jo-gun's position for years, spoke first. His voice dripped with contempt. What is this? Why is the cleaning staff in our executive meeting? Jo-gun walked to the head of the table, sat down in his chair, the one that commanded the room. Sit. It was a command, not a request. Everyone sat. Angelina stood near the door, holding Ruby, looking like she wanted to disappear into the expensive wallpaper. "Come here," Jo-gun said to her. His voice was soft but firm. She shook her head slightly. "Jo-gun, I shouldn't be here." "I said, come here." Angelina walked forward slowly, each step deliberate. The executives watched with confusion and barely hidden disgust. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight. Director Kwon leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. "Park, if you wanted entertainment during meetings, you could have at least chosen better company." "She smells like floor cleaner." Jo-gun's eyes went ice cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Without a word, he stood up, walked to Angelina, took Ruby from her arms with a gentleness that shocked everyone in the room. The baby looked up at him, surprised but not scared. Then she smiled and grabbed his tie with both hands. He walked back to his chair at the head of the table and sat down with Ruby on his lap. She immediately started playing with his expensive watch, leaving tiny fingerprints on the crystal. The room was completely silent. You could hear people breathing. "Let me be very clear," Jo-gun said, adjusting Ruby so she was comfortable. His voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. "This is Ruby Park Rose. She's 2 years old, and she's my daughter." You could have heard a pin drop. Director Kwon's face went pale, then red. "Your daughter?" "My daughter and heir." Jo-gun looked around the table, meeting each executive's eyes in turn. "Which makes her future owner of this company. So when you insult her mother, you insult the next CEO. Choose your words carefully." Angelina was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Director Kwon tried to recover, his voice shaking slightly. "Park, this is clearly a mistake. Some woman shows up with a baby and claims it's yours. We all know how these schemes work." Jo-gun smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile that had made grown men resign rather than face him in negotiations. "Pull up the DNA results I had done at 4 a.m. His assistant projected the results onto the screen. Official, stamped, undeniable. 99.9% match. Want to keep talking? Director Kwon's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Jo-gun bounced Ruby gently on his knee. She was playing with his watch now, completely unbothered by the tension in the room. Her tiny laugh was the only sound. "Now," Jo-gun continued, his voice back to business, "we have actual business to discuss. The merger documents for the Gene Corporation deal. Director Kwon, you've been leading this negotiation for 6 months. Walk us through the final terms." For the next 20 minutes, Kwon presented the deal. His voice shook occasionally, but he pushed through. A $500 million merger that would expand their reach into Southeast Asia. The contracts were ready to sign. Everything looked perfect on paper. Jo-gun was about to approve it when Angelina spoke. "Wait." Everyone turned to look at her. She was still standing near the door, looking uncomfortable in her blue uniform. "I'm sorry, but..." She took a breath. "The liability clause. Section 12. Something's wrong with it." Director Kwon laughed. Actually laughed. "Excuse me?" "The liability clause," Angelina repeated, stepping forward. Her voice was stronger now. "It says you'll assume all existing debts and legal issues from Gin Corporation. But Gin Corporation has 3 active lawsuits in Thailand that aren't disclosed in the documents. They're trying to hide $90 million in liability." The room went completely silent. Jo-gun leaned forward. "How do you know this?" Angelina hesitated. I used to work in corporate law, before Ruby. I clean your offices at night, but I read everything I find. The Gene Corporation lawsuit was in a folder on Director Kwan's desk 2 weeks ago. I noticed it wasn't in these merger papers. Every executive turned to stare at Director Kwan. His face had gone from pale to red to a sickly gray. That's ridiculous. She's making things up. Jo-gun handed Ruby to his assistant and stood up. Pull the Gene Corporation legal records, all of them, now. 10 minutes later, the truth was on the screen. 3 active lawsuits, $93 million in hidden liability, and emails showing Director Kwan knew about all of it. He'd been planning to let Jo-gun sign a deal that would have destroyed the company. Jo-gun's voice was ice, pure, cold ice. Get out. Director Kwan stood up. His hands were shaking. Park, I can explain. Security. 2 guards appeared at the door. Escort Director Kwan out of the building. He no longer works here. As Kwan was dragged out, protesting, promises turning to threats, Jo-gun turned to Angelina. She was standing there in her blue cleaning uniform, surrounded by executives in $1,000 suits, and she'd just saved his entire company. You're hired, he said. Angelina blinked. What? Chief Investment Officer. You start tomorrow. Salary is $800,000 a year. The entire boardroom gasped. Angelina thought he was joking. He wasn't. The next morning, Jo-gun's assistant showed up at the penthouse guest suite with a team of stylists, a lawyer, and a contract. Mr. Park wants you to sign this before 9 a.m., the assistant said, handing Angelina a folder. Ruby was eating breakfast in a high chair that had been delivered overnight, along with about 50 other baby items, everything from designer baby clothes to educational toys. The penthouse had been transformed into something that could actually accommodate a child. Angelina opened the folder and almost dropped it. Chief Investment Officer. $800,000 salary. Full benefits. Stock options. A clause that said Ruby would have a trust fund of $10 million. This is insane, she whispered. Mr. Park doesn't do insane, the assistant replied. He does strategic. You saved the company $500 million yesterday. This is him being practical. Angelina looked at Ruby, who was happily smashing banana pieces on her tray. For 2 years, she'd been working 3 jobs to keep them fed, cleaning offices at night, waitressing on weekends, doing freelance bookkeeping when Ruby was asleep. She'd been surviving on 4 hours of sleep and instant noodles. And now the man who'd left her pregnant was offering her almost $1 million a year. I need to think about it, she said. The assistant checked her watch. You have until 8:45. The board meeting starts at 9 and Mr. Park wants you there as an executive, not a guest. Angelina signed the contract at 8:43, not because of the money, but because when she'd looked at Ruby this morning, she'd realized her daughter deserved a father, even if that father was the Ice King of Seoul. The board meeting was brutal. Half the executives thought Jo-gun had lost his mind. The other half were terrified of him, and everyone was staring at Angelina like she was an alien who'd just landed in their boardroom. She wasn't in her blue uniform anymore. The stylist had put her in a black suit that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. But she still felt like the cleaning lady pretending to belong. Miss Rose will be reviewing all active contracts and investments, Jo-gun announced. Effective immediately, nothing gets my signature without her approval. Director Lee, an older woman who'd been with the company for 20 years, raised her hand. With all respect, Park, she has no credentials, no MBA, no track record in corporate investment. She has a law degree from Columbia, Jo-gun replied calmly. Angelina's head snapped toward him. She'd never told him that. Director Lee blinked. Columbia? She graduated top 5% of her class, Jo-gun continued, reading from a file. Worked at Morrison and Associates in New York for 2 years before she left to have Ruby. She's more qualified than half the people in this room. He'd investigated her. Completely. Angelina didn't know whether to be angry or impressed. For the next 3 hours, she sat through presentations on investment portfolios, acquisition targets, and market strategies. And slowly, something happened. She started speaking up, pointing out risks, suggesting alternatives, catching details everyone else had missed. By lunch, even Director Lee was listening to her. By the end of the day, Angelina had flagged 3 more problematic contracts and saved the company another $20 million. Jo-gun walked her back to his office afterward. Ruby was with his assistant, who'd apparently become a part-time nanny, and seemed thrilled about it. "You were right," he said quietly. "About what?" "You are the smartest person in the room." Angelina looked at him. Really looked at him. 3 years ago, he'd been charming and funny and dangerous in the best way. Now he was all business and control and ice. Except when he looked at Ruby. Then something in his eyes melted. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Doing what?" "All of this. The job, the penthouse. Yesterday you didn't even know she existed." Jo-gun was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 3 years ago, I was a coward. I left you because I didn't know how to be anything except ruthless. But Ruby deserves better. And so do you. I don't need you to save me. I know. You've been saving yourself for 2 years while I was being an idiot. He looked at her. But maybe we could try saving each other. Before Angelina could respond, his phone rang. He answered it, listened for 5 seconds, and his entire face went dark. "What is it?" Angelina asked. "My mother," he said quietly. "She just found out about Ruby, and she's on her way here right now." Jo-gun's mother arrived like a storm. Madam Park swept into the office with 2 assistants, a lawyer, and enough disapproval to freeze the entire building. She was elegant, cold, and absolutely terrifying. The kind of woman who'd built empires through sheer force of will and strategic marriages. "So," she said, looking at Angelina like she was something stuck to her shoe. "You're the American cleaning woman who trapped my son." Angelina stood up from her chair. "I didn't trap anyone." "Really? You show up with a baby and suddenly you're living in his penthouse and working as an executive? That sounds like trapping to me." Jo-gun stepped between them. "Mother, that's enough." "Don't mother me. I raised you better than this. A one-night stand is one thing, but bringing her into the company? Making her an officer? Have you lost your mind?" "It was a 1-week relationship, not a one-night stand. And she saved this company $500 million in 2 days. Madam Park ignored him and turned to Angelina. "How much do you want?" "Excuse me?" "To disappear. Name your price. 5 million? 10? I'll have it transferred today." Angelina felt her blood go cold. "I'm not disappearing. And Ruby isn't a problem you can pay to go away. That child is an embarrassment. Born out of wedlock to a foreigner? The scandal will destroy our family's reputation." "That child," Jo-gun said, his voice dropping to ice, "is your granddaughter." Madam Park turned to her son. "She's a mistake, and you know it." What happened next shocked everyone in the room. Jo-gun walked to his desk, picked up a document, and tore it in half. It was a resignation letter, one his mother had clearly prepared for Angelina to sign. "Angelina and Ruby are moving into the main house," he said quietly. "Into my wing. Permanently." His mother's face went pale. "You can't be serious." "If you insult them again, I'll remove you from the family trust. Test me." The room went completely silent. Madam Park stared at her son like she didn't recognize him. Then she turned and walked out without another word. Her assistants scrambled after her. When they were gone, Angelina sank into her chair. "Your family hates me." "My family hates everyone." Jo-gun sat on the edge of his desk, but they'll learn to deal with it. That night, they moved into Jo-gun's penthouse. Not the guest suite, his actual residence. 3 floors of marble and glass and luxury that made Angelina feel like she'd stepped into a different universe. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, art on the walls that was probably worth more than her childhood home. Ruby didn't care about the luxury. She just wanted to explore. Jo-gun spent the evening following her around, making sure she didn't hurt herself. At one point, his phone rang during a diaper change. He answered it while holding Ruby's legs up with one hand. "Park speaking. No, the Singapore deal is off. I told you yesterday, because the terms are terrible. Look, I'm in the middle of something. Can this wait?" He was trying to fasten the diaper with one hand while Ruby tried to roll away. Angelina watched from the doorway, trying not to laugh. The Ice King of Seoul, one of the most feared businessmen in Asia, was losing a fight with a 2-year-old and a diaper. "Hold on," he said into the phone. Then to Ruby, "Stop moving. Please, I'm trying to help you." Ruby giggled and kicked her legs. Jo-gun looked up at Angelina. "How do you do this?" "Practice," she said, walking over. "You're putting it on backwards." "There's a backwards?" She took over, fixing the diaper in about 10 seconds. Jo-gun watched her like she'd just performed surgery. "You make it look easy." 2 years of practice. You'll get there." He hung up the phone without saying goodbye to whoever was on the other end. Later, after Ruby was asleep, they sat in his living room. The city lights of Seoul spread out below them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This is weird," Angelina said. "What is?" "This. Us. Playing house like we're a normal family." Jo-gun was quiet for a moment. "Maybe we could be." "You don't even know me anymore, and I don't know you." "So we'll learn." He looked at her. "I have 3 years to make up for. I'm not wasting any more time." The news broke 3 days later. Ice King's secret love child with cleaning woman. Every major news outlet in Seoul had the story, complete with photos of Angelina in her blue uniform, photos of Ruby, and speculation about how much money she was getting from Jo-gun. The stock price dropped 6% in the first hour. By noon, it was down 12%. Jo-gun's phone didn't stop ringing. Board members demanding an emergency meeting. Investors threatening to pull out. His family lawyer saying they needed to do damage control immediately. Jo-gun ignored all of them. He was watching Angelina. She was sitting in his office, reading the news articles on her phone. Her hands were shaking. "They're calling me a gold digger," she said quietly. "They're saying I planned this whole thing, that I got pregnant on purpose to trap you." "It's not true." "I know it's not true, but everyone else thinks it is." She looked up at him. "Your stock is crashing because of me." "The stock will recover." "Your mother was right. I'm destroying your reputation." Jo-gun walked over and took the phone from her hands. "My reputation was built on being ruthless. Let me be ruthless now." He called an emergency press conference for that afternoon. His PR team begged him not to. His lawyer said it would make things worse. Jo-gun did it anyway. At 3 p.m., he stood in front of 50 reporters and cameras. Angelina was beside him, holding Ruby. She'd wanted to stay hidden. He'd refused. "I'll make this simple," Jo-gun said into the microphones. "Yes, Ruby is my daughter. Yes, her mother and I had a relationship 3 years ago in New York. No, this was not a scheme or a trap. I'm the one who failed to stay in contact. I'm the one who wasn't there. Angelina raised our daughter alone for 2 years while I was being a coward. The reporter started shouting questions. He ignored them. Angelina Rose is now the Chief Investment Officer of Park Industries. She earned that position by saving this company over $500 million in the past week. She has a law degree from Columbia and more intelligence than most of my executive team combined. Anyone who has a problem with her qualifications can bring it up with me personally. He looked directly into the cameras. And to the outlets calling her a gold digger, let me be clear. She didn't come looking for me. I found her scrubbing floors in my building at midnight, trying to feed our daughter. So before you write another story about how she trapped me, remember that she was surviving just fine without me. The press conference lasted 10 more minutes. By the time it was over, the stock had stabilized, but the damage was done. That night, someone leaked a resignation letter, except it wasn't the real one. It was a fake. A document claiming Angelina was resigning and admitting the whole thing was a scheme for money. The document looked official. It had forged signatures, legal language. It looked completely real. By morning, the stock was crashing again, down 20%. Board members were demanding Angelina be fired. Jo-gun's family was threatening to remove him as CEO. And someone had spray-painted "Gold Digger" on the door of their penthouse. Angelina was packing when Jo-gun came home. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm leaving. This was a mistake. Ruby and I will be fine." "Because if we involve the police, they'll panic. We do this my way." He was already getting dressed, his mind working through possibilities. Director Kwon, Jin Corporation, the merger. This wasn't random. This was revenge. "Then what do we do?" Angelina asked. Jo-gun looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't control or calculation. It was rage. Pure, cold rage. "We go to war." For the next 6 hours, Jo-gun became someone Angelina had never seen before. He called in favors from people whose names she didn't recognize. He contacted private security teams that operated in legal gray areas. He tracked financial transfers, phone records, and security footage with a precision that was terrifying. He didn't just use his business connections. He used everything. Old contacts from university, people who owed him favors, people who owed him money, people who feared him. By 8 a.m., he'd found them. Director Kwon and 2 Jin Corporation executives, hiding in a warehouse outside Seoul with Ruby. Jo-gun didn't call the police. He called his security team. 12 men who looked more like soldiers than bodyguards. "I want Kwon alive," Jo-gun said as they prepared to leave. His voice was calm, but his eyes were dead. "The others? I don't care." Angelina grabbed his arm. "I'm coming with you." "No." "She's my daughter too." Jo-gun looked at her, saw the same rage in her eyes that was in his. "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say. Understand?" She nodded. They drove to the warehouse in 3 black cars, no sirens, no police, just Jo-gun, his team, and a plan. The warehouse was abandoned, surrounded by empty lots, perfect place to hide, perfect place for an ambush. Jo-gun's team moved in first. Angelina waited in the car with Jo-gun, watching through binoculars. She could see Ruby through a window, crying in a corner, scared, but alive. "I'm going to kill him," Angelina whispered. "Get in line," Jo-gun replied. The security team breached the warehouse. There were shouts, sounds of fighting, the crack of something breaking. Then silence. Jo-gun's phone buzzed. "Clear, target secured, the child is safe." They ran inside. Ruby was in the arms of one of the security guards, crying. The moment she saw Angelina, she reached out, screaming, "Mama!" Angelina grabbed her, holding her so tight Ruby squeaked in protest. Jo-gun checked her over. No injuries, just scared. Director Kwon was on his knees, hands zip-tied behind his back. One of the Jin Corporation executives was unconscious on the floor. The other was restrained, blood running from his nose. Jo-gun walked over to Kwon slowly. "You made a mistake." Kwon tried to look defiant. Blood trickled from his lip. "You can't prove anything. I'll say you kidnapped me, that this was all you." Jo-gun smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "I don't need to prove anything." He pulled out his phone and showed Kwon the screen. "While you were here playing kidnapper, my lawyers were filing criminal charges against you. Kidnapping, corporate espionage, fraud, attempted hostile takeover. And the Jin Corporation executives who hired you just got arrested at the airport trying to flee the country." Kwon's face went pale. "You can't." "I already did." Jo-gun leaned down. "You threatened my family. That was your last mistake." He turned to his security team. "Call the police, now. Tell them we've recovered my daughter and caught the kidnappers. Make sure every news outlet in Seoul knows that Director Kwon and Jin Corporation tried to kidnap a 2-year-old child for corporate revenge." As the police sirens approached, Jo-gun walked back to Angelina and Ruby. His daughter was still crying, clinging to her mother. He wrapped his arms around both of them. "It's over," he said quietly. "We're safe now." But Angelina could still feel him shaking. Not from fear, from rage that hadn't fully cooled. The Ice King had gone to war for his family, and everyone in Seoul was about to find out what happened when you threatened Park Jo-gun's daughter. The arrests made international news. Director Kwon, 2 Jin Corporation executives, charges of kidnapping, corporate espionage, fraud, and attempted hostile takeover. Park Industries' stock didn't just recover, it skyrocketed. Investors saw how Jo-gun had handled the crisis and decided he was exactly the kind of ruthless leader they wanted. Within a week, the company's value had increased by 30%. But Jo-gun didn't care about the stock price. He cared about the little girl, who now refused to sleep unless both her parents were in the room. Ruby had nightmares for days after the kidnapping. She'd wake up screaming. Only Angelina could calm her down, and only Jo-gun's presence would let her go back to sleep. They became a strange, broken family, sleeping in the same room, eating breakfast together. Jo-gun working from home so Ruby could see him. And slowly, something changed. Not just for Ruby, for all of them. One morning, Jo-gun was making coffee when Angelina walked in. "You're getting good at this," she said, watching him juggle the coffee maker and Ruby's breakfast. "I had a good teacher." He handed her a cup. "How is she?" "Better. She didn't wake up last night." They both knew what that meant. Ruby was healing, but it also meant she wouldn't need both of them in the room anymore. Things could go back to normal, whatever that was. "The Global Investor Gala is next week," Jo-gun said quietly. "I need to go, show strength, prove the company is stable." "That makes sense." "I want you to come with me." Angelina nearly dropped her coffee. "Jo-gun, I can't. That's for executives and billionaires and my chief investment officer." He looked at her. "You've earned it. The entire industry knows you're the one who caught the merger fraud. You saved us. Twice. Your family will be there. Your mother." "Yes, and they need to see us together." He stepped closer. "I need them to know you're not going anywhere." Angelina's heart was beating too fast. "What are we doing here, Jo-gun?" "What do you mean?" "This, us. We're playing family, but we're not really together. We're not anything." Jo-gun was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want us to be?" Before she could answer, Ruby started crying from her high chair. Breakfast crisis. The moment was gone. The night of the global gala arrived. Angelina had been terrified all week. Jo-geun's stylist had brought her a dozen dresses to choose from. She'd picked the simplest one, a black gown that wouldn't draw attention. When the stylist saw her choice, she'd smiled and said, "Mr. Park said you'd pick that one. He asked me to bring you this instead." She'd pulled out a different dress. Gold. Stunning. The kind of dress that demanded attention. "I can't wear that," Angelina had protested. Mr. Park was very specific. He said, and I quote, "She's been invisible for too long. Make sure everyone sees her." So now Angelina was standing in Jo-geun's penthouse, wearing a gold dress that cost more than her first car, feeling like an imposter. Jo-geun walked in, wearing a black tuxedo. He stopped when he saw her. Just stopped and stared. "Is it too much?" Angelina asked nervously. "It's perfect." His voice was quiet. "You're perfect." They arrived at the gala together. The moment they stepped out of the car, cameras started flashing. Every major news outlet in Seoul was there. Every business leader, every socialite. And they were all staring at Angelina. Not because she was the cleaning woman anymore, but because she was stunning. Jo-geun kept his hand on her back as they walked the red carpet. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Park, is it true Miss Rose stopped the hostile takeover? Mr. Park, are you and Miss Rose together? Is Ruby here tonight?" Jo-geun stopped and faced the cameras. Angelina Rose is the Chief Investment Officer of Park Industries. She's saved this company over $800 million in the past month. And yes, we're together. Any other questions? The crowd went silent. Then he smiled. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a gala to attend." Inside, the whispers started immediately. Every executive, every board member, every socialite was staring. Jo-geun's mother was standing near the bar with her circle of influential friends. Her face was ice when she saw them. But Jo-geun didn't care. He walked Angelina straight to the center of the room, to the main stage where the CEO speeches happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, "Park Jo-geun, CEO of Park Industries." Jo-geun walked onto the stage. Angelina started to step back, but he grabbed her hand. "You're coming with me." "Jo-geun, I can't." "Yes, you can." They walked on stage together. Every eye in the room was on them. "3 weeks ago," Jo-geun said into the microphone, "someone tried to destroy my company. They leaked fake documents, crashed our stock, and kidnapped my daughter." The room was completely silent. "They failed because of one person." He turned to Angelina. "Angelina Rose, the woman they called a gold digger, the woman they said didn't belong here. She's the one who saved everything." He gestured for someone off stage. His assistant appeared with a folder. "Effective immediately, Angelina Rose is being promoted to Executive Vice President of Park Industries. She'll be overseeing all major investments and acquisitions. And she'll have a seat on the board." The room erupted in whispers. Angelina was staring at him in shock. "Jo-geun, what are you doing?" "What I should have done 3 years ago." He took her hand. "Choosing you." The next 3 months were a whirlwind. Director Kwon and the Jin Corporation executives were sentenced to prison, 10 years each. The news called it the biggest corporate crime case in South Korean history. Park Industries became the most valuable company in Seoul, and Jo-geun became a different kind of CEO. He still worked long hours, still made ruthless business decisions, but now he left the office at 6 p.m. every day, because Ruby had learned to say, "Dada, come home," and he wasn't going to miss dinner. Angelina was terrifying the boardroom. In 6 months, she'd restructured 3 divisions, caught 2 more fraud attempts, and increased company profits by 40%. The executives who doubted her now fought to get meetings with her. Even Jo-gun's mother had stopped sending resignation letters. Mostly. Today was Ruby's 3rd birthday. They were having a party at the penthouse. Not a corporate event, just family. Angelina was in the kitchen, trying to assemble a cake that Ruby had specifically requested. 3 layers, pink frosting, unicorns. It was a disaster. Jo-gun walked in and saw the cake. That's a mess, I know. Angelina was covered in frosting. I should have just hired someone. It's perfect. He grabbed a spatula and started helping. Ruby won't care what it looks like. She'll just care that you made it. They worked together in comfortable silence. This had become their life. Small moments, inside jokes, Ruby's laugh echoing through the penthouse. It wasn't the fairy tale Angelina had imagined when she was 25 and falling for a charming businessman in New York. It was better. It was real. The doorbell rang. Jo-gun's assistant appeared with a small box. This just arrived for Miss Ruby. From you, sir. Jo-gun took the box. Thank you, that'll be all. When they were alone, he handed the box to Angelina. I want you to give this to her. What is it? Open it. Inside was a small gold locket, brand new, engraved with Ruby's initials, exactly like the one Angelina still wore. Jo-gun, I gave you a locket 3 years ago and promised I'd never forget you. Then I disappeared for 3 years and missed everything. Ruby's birth, her first steps, her first words. I can't get those back. He closed Angelina's hand around the box. But I can promise I'll be here for everything else. Every birthday, every milestone, every moment. Angelina felt tears in her eyes. You've already been here for 6 months. I want to be here forever. He pulled out another box, a different one, smaller. Angelina's heart stopped. Is that? Marry me. It wasn't a question. It was pure Jo-gun, confident, direct, completely lacking in traditional romance. She laughed through her tears. You're supposed to get on one knee. I don't kneel for anyone. But then he smiled and got on one knee anyway. Angelina rose. You're the smartest person I know, the strongest person I know, the most stubborn person I know. He opened the box. The ring was simple, elegant, perfect. And I've been in love with you since New York. I was just too much of a coward to admit it. Marry me. Not because of Ruby, not because of the company. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make me want to be better. Because when I'm with you, I'm not the Ice King. I'm just me. Angelina looked at this man, the Ice King of Seoul, who'd learned to change diapers and make terrible birthday cakes and leave work early for dinner, who'd gone to war to protect their daughter, who'd stood on a stage in front of everyone and chosen her. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He stood up and kissed her, right there in the kitchen, covered in cake frosting, while their daughter played in the next room. When they pulled apart, Ruby was standing in the doorway. Dada? Mama? Why crying? Jo-gun picked her up. Happy crying, little one, very happy. He fastened the new locket around Ruby's neck. She looked at it with wide eyes. Pretty. Just like your mother, Jo-gun said, looking at Angelina. That night at Ruby's party, Jo-gun made an announcement to the handful of family and friends they'd invited. Angelina and I are getting married. His mother looked like she'd swallowed glass. But then Ruby ran over to her grandmother and said, Grandma,
Mama and Dada getting married. I get pretty dress.
And even Madame Park couldn't resist her granddaughter's excitement. Yes, darling, a very pretty dress. 3 months later, they got married. Not a huge corporate wedding, just something small, meaningful. Ruby was the flower girl. She took her job very seriously, walking down the aisle with careful steps, scattering petals like they were precious jewels. At the reception, Jo-gun gave a speech. His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with emotion he no longer tried to hide. 3 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I left the woman I loved because I didn't think I knew how to be anything except ruthless. Then she showed up in my office, scrubbing floors at midnight, raising our daughter alone. And she taught me that real strength isn't about being ruthless. It's about showing up. Every day. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He raised his glass, looking directly at Angelina. To Angelina, the woman who saved my company. And saved me. Everyone drank. Later, Angelina found Jo-gun on the balcony. Ruby was asleep inside, worn out from dancing, still wearing her flower girl dress. The Seoul skyline glittered before them. The city that had once terrified her now felt like home. Having regrets yet? She asked, leaning against the railing. About what? He moved beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Marrying the cleaning lady. Jo-gun pulled her close. I didn't marry a cleaning lady. I married the woman who's smarter than me, tougher than me, and somehow still puts up with me. He kissed her forehead. The gesture was so tender it made her throat tight. Best decision I ever made. Angelina looked out at Seoul's skyline. 3 years ago, she'd been alone, pregnant, and terrified, working 3 jobs, eating instant noodles, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Now, she was standing on a balcony in a wedding dress, married to the man she'd never stopped loving, with a daughter who would never know what it meant to struggle. We did it, she said softly. Did what? We survived, all of us. Jo-gun wrapped his arms around her, held her like she was the most precious thing in his world. We did more than survive. We won. Inside, Ruby stirred in her sleep. Her little hand clutched the gold locket, the twin to the one around her mother's neck. 3 years ago, a locket had connected them. Now it was a symbol of everything they'd fought for. Family, love, second chances. The kind of love that survives mistakes and time and pride. The Ice King had melted, and the woman in the blue dress had become a queen. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. If Ruby's story touched your heart, I'd love for you to join our community. We share stories like this every week, tales of love, second chances, and the courage to fight for what matters. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances? What would you have done in Angelina's position? I read every comment, and your stories inspire the next tale we tell together. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.